Whew, sorry about that, guys. Some technical difficulties, but we are live now. Welcome to our second to last summer reading video, even though it's not really the summer anymore.
Actually, technically it is. I'm pretty sure.
When does fall start?
Later September?
I think it's later September.
21st, I think.
And what you're saying is we planned this perfectly.
Perfectly. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, well, this week we read chapter 11. So this question is, how could a loving God allow so much suffering? This was a shorter chapter, but also very dense. And so I think how we may start is just by talking about, because I know this chapter hits on a theology of suffering and different types of theologies of suffering. Now, okay, no, a theophany is a theology of evil, right?
Theophany is an appearance of God in...
Oh, then what am I thinking?
I'm not sure.
I thought what is a theophany? Is that... Theophany is a visible manifestation of God. Oh my gosh, I'm starting this off on the wrong note. You know what I'm talking about, like a theology of evil?
Oh, yeah, I don't think I know what it's called.
Theodicy.
Theodicy? Yeah, I didn't know that.
So not a theophany, sorry. A theodicy.
Okay.
Is a different understanding of, or your understanding of evil and suffering. So she presents two different views, a very kind of irreligious, secular understanding of suffering, which really isn't anything. It's just kind of like, it's nothing, it's meaningless. And then, which kind of is tied to Richard Dawkins and some of the atheist perspective and so on. And then she hits on a very Eastern spiritual Buddhist view of suffering, which is very detached from the world. And so I would love to hear from everyone just about what are some ways in which you've understood suffering, like from others and how others have understood it, or I know this is a common question that's asked a lot, especially if you're in ministry. You know, this is probably something we're constantly engaging with. Why would God allow this? So why would he allow suffering? You know, if you guys want to share any experience or thoughts or, you know, I don't know. I'm curious to start there about like different ways in which you've heard from others about their understanding of suffering and God, and just their experience of this question, because I feel like this is a question that almost everyone's faced, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I think it's important, kind of the context in which the question is asked. So when I first think about this, I think of someone who might be experiencing a loss. And in those circumstances and in those contexts, it is more likely not helpful to kind of explain to someone, okay, well, let me make sense of this for you real quick. You had the fall of man that happened in Genesis 3, or God's plan, all true, all biblical, all right. But timing with that stuff is super, super crucial. And I've seen that misplayed. And so again, it's important to understand the right timing, because a lot of times if somebody is going through loss, ministry of presence or just being there and saying very little is probably the most helpful. Now, the other way that I've seen that, especially largely here in the West, would be the prosperity gospel, where, you know, you become a Christian and God makes his favor and his love for you known through the manifestation of material things or physical health. And, you know, I know that theology, unfortunately, has also informed a lot of other theology across the global church. And frankly, you know, I've heard it and didn't know what to do with it at a certain point in my life. But now when you look at the biblical narrative as a whole, or just Christ himself, you see zero to no room at all for, again, this type of thinking around what it looks like to be a Christian. So again, especially with what you see in the New Testament, it's crystal clear that when you follow Jesus, if anything, things are going to get harder, not easier. So there's some of the stuff that pops off my head. Of course, there's the deeper question of why does God let evil exist, and then you get into the fall and all sorts of stuff like that. But go ahead.
You hit on a good point that I was thinking of throughout this chapter, which was the prosperity gospel, like how their understanding of suffering is very dangerous and damning and legalistic, in the sense of, this must be happening to you because you don't have enough faith. You must have sinned. It's kind of the whole book of Job thing, like with the friends of you must have done something wrong for this to happen. Or if things aren't changing, you don't have enough faith, and you need to pray harder and you need to give more and so on, because God, there's the only understanding of suffering is negative and as a result of something you've done, which, like you said, is completely contradictory to the message of the Bible, to what we see in the Bible. God himself suffered. Mm-hmm. And so to think that you, who's imperfect and so on, like the perfect human being, the only perfect human being on earth, suffered willingly. And so you're right. I think that is probably the most prevalent kind of teaching of suffering in the kind of religious South, but the secular narrative as well, as far as like, well, it's either as a result of something you've done or it's meaningless. And, you just need to kind of accept that life sucks, Any thoughts from Amy Parker?
I'll share just something that I was thinking of when she talks about suffering in story. And she quotes a friend whose teenage son was brain damaged from an accident. They said, people often think that the reality of suffering is an embarrassment to the Christian faith, but I think suffering is the greatest apologetic for Christianity that there is. And it just got me thinking, just the way that society has turned everything, either like you were saying, you don't have enough faith and therefore your child didn't make it, whatever this horrible circumstances, or you're embarrassed. But like this point is, if we could openly walk through hard things, I think it would minister in so many ways. One, because so many people are walking through hard things and they think that they're alone. That's the value of the grief share group that we have, is people understand like what I'm feeling is normal. I also think that it would keep people from thinking that we have a faith that's so easily broken, because God can handle those hard places as we suffer, because he knows what it is and he knows how to walk through it with us. And so that it made me think about how our lack of authenticity, for lack of a better word, it actually does damage even in suffering and in this.
Good. Parker, anything from you?
Yeah, this chapter is great. I'm sorry, I've been trying to figure out my Wi-Fi issues. I've just been skipping all over the place.
It looked like you fell asleep at one point.
I was not asleep. I've been switching between a hotspot and other Wi-Fi networks. So if I start glitching out, just bear with me. But yeah, I would just kind of really connect with what all of you were saying about like this chapter is like restoring, I feel like, the meaning to suffering. And it just reminds me how much of I feel like a disservice we do to biblical suffering when was going through something. Oh, I think, did I just cut out?
Yeah, just a little bit, but you're fine.
Oh man. But also just lost my train of thought because but just like when someone's going through something, oftentimes, like Hunter, you were saying, we'd want to attribute it to a lack of faith, which is just so wrong and backwards, or we just want to say, well, everything happens for a reason, right? Which I do believe that God is bringing meaning and redemption in everything, right? But that doesn't make it the right response, like Lane, what you were saying. But this truth that in our suffering, Jesus is with us, right? And really what he had to say, what she had to say on page 200, when she was talking about the story of Lazarus, the top of it, and she's speaking to the story, saying that like, as you stand here in your desperate grief, your greatest need is not to have your brother back again, have me, right? And this reminder that suffering brings us back to our greatest need, which is ultimately Jesus. And that is such, I feel like, a beautiful story that we've seen time and time again of people who've gone through suffering and have actually come out the better for it because they have come out closer to Jesus and realized, no, this is true life. Like, that was horrible, and Jesus was with me through it. But I'm now closer to my Savior. I'm closer to my Heavenly Father. And that's to me one of the greatest gifts of suffering. And oftentimes the meaning behind it is that we grow closer.
That's really good. I agree. I think this chapter, she really helps us see how Christianity does give us meaning to our suffering that we experience. And so this is not something we should be afraid of as Christians to address. I think when we hear about a mother who's lost a child, we think, oh my gosh, like I can't even imagine what that experience must be like, how that must be challenging her faith, and so on. And to your point, Parker, like, we want reason, we want an explanation, we want meaning and understanding for why this happened. But the truth is, the narrative that kind of the atheist perspective gives amputates all hope. It just gives you absolutely no answer and no hope. And so it leaves people bitter, angry, and empty, for their lives in the way that they experience suffering in life. And so it rots them away over time. Whereas Christianity can actually offer hope, with our understanding of eternity, but also understanding that we may not know the cause or the reasons for these things. I think we want, if we can't find a good reason, we can easily blame God. And so that kind of is what turns us to that atheist view of suffering, is like, how could have God allowed that? He must be a cruel God then, right? And so we begin correlating even the question, like, why or how could God allow blank, already begins to kind of accuse him of being the one responsible for these horrible things that are happening, because he must be a horrible God. It's making a lot of assumptions and correlations that that just aren't true. And so we talked about some of the different narratives, but then she gets into the Christian perspective of suffering, and she uses the whole Jesus and Lazarus passage from John. Anything stick out from you guys there, just about how he handles the situation, but also how she mirrors kind of our experience as humans, like Mary and Martha, through this? And I want to hear from you guys first.
I mean, I would just say the empathy, the sympathy that, we see in Jesus's response right before the act of resurrection. It's this shortest verse in the Bible, and Jesus wept. And yet it is potentially one of the most profound and important scriptures for people who suffer. Because again, it does take God and his, greatness and majesty, and it puts him right beside you, in a sense, to know that he's grieving with you, and that he's experienced every range of emotion that exists within the human mind. And that just takes it a step further to know that not only can God redeem and use this, but he emotionally empathizes. And I think that's a game changer. And when you think about it, it changes how we get to view suffering, and the hope that we have, even in the midst where the explanations and the pleasantries don't cut it. Just to know that Jesus weeps too is profound.
Yeah, and Lane, kind of to add on to your point too, I love what she has to say on 201 about him actually bearing our grief and suffering and our sorrow. It reminds me of that, like, Jesus is the friend that when you lose someone, they don't just send a casserole and a nice note. No, this is the person that comes over and they stay with you for a week and they sit with you in it and they bear like with you while you're going through it, and they're helping you, right? And they're taking on that burden themselves as well, right? It just reminds me, I don't know, just really just the incredible love of Jesus for us, that he doesn't just say, oh, that's hard.
Yeah.
Sorry. Like Lane, you're saying, he's right next to us, he's weeping, and he's bearing that grief and that sorrow ultimately to the cross, which is the most incredible revelation of it. But it's just a great reminder when we're going through suffering.
Just made me once again draw the differences between faiths. Just that Jesus, like she says at the top of 201, is no remote deity watching suffering from a safe distance. He doesn't ask things of us that he's not himself walked out or walked through. I don't know, in this chapter, I think especially when she drew some different, not parallels, but comparisons, it just really made me think of how incredible it is that we serve a Savior who has felt everything that we feel and more, and that he is able to actually meet us in that, where I know I've seen people when we were in India, we'd watch them put food on idols, and they're hoping for something that can never deliver. And Jesus is always with us.
Well, me think of that passage in Hebrews about how he's a sympathetic high priest. God himself took on flesh and suffered. And so he can sympathize. And Parker, to your point, he's with us in our pain and suffering. He's by our side. And it can actually be a way to experience even deeper intimacy with him. I loved how she taught on suffering and sin, on how Christianity reverses this paradigm that those who live in privilege now, I think she uses the Lazarus and the rich ruler parable earlier to kind of illustrate this, but she's kind of saying on how it reverses the paradigm of Buddhism, about this teaching of karma and reincarnation. She says, with that logic, our present circumstances are the result of past actions. So the circumstances we find ourselves in now are a result of past things that we've done. Sins in a past life can determine suffering here and now, but it's not so with Christianity. It reverses that paradigm. Those who live in privilege now are warned of an afterlife of suffering if they do not take the medicine of Christ. And those who suffer now are actually closest to God's heart and are promised an eternity, of prosperity with him. And so to see that, again, it's that eternal perspective, realizing that, if it's one thing we are promised as Christians in this life is to suffer. And so Christianity actually helps us understand suffering in a way that the world just doesn't understand. Instead of seeing it as a result of sin or a result of bad things we've done, we can see it as something that the Lord actually uses to draw us nearer to him and to grow us and mature us. Suffering is actually seen as a good thing. And I know there's different forms of suffering. So, when we talk about like grieving a loved one, like absolutely, that's not something we are necessarily like celebrating and glad to go through, because you see the apostles like rejoicing to suffer for the name of Christ. So there are different types of suffering, but understanding that we have a sovereign God who is with us in the suffering and is using the suffering and is sovereign over the suffering. And knowing that we have an eternity ahead of us, that gives us hope. But
And that reminds me too, just how powerful the testimony is of someone who's gone through suffering and has felt the nearness of Jesus, right? Like, how abnormal is that to a watching world that we could actually say, I went through this horrible thing, but Jesus was near to me. And like, I was actually helped through it because of his nearness to me. And I saw that he was for me. Right? Like, what a powerful story that is to the goodness of God.
Yeah, that is good.
Yeah, I would say if you're afraid or like kind of don't really, or not really sure how to talk to other people about how suffering can fit into a Christian framework, just talk to, you know, your Christian friends and loved ones, because you're going to find out that the majority of stories were changed and redeemed when suffering happened, because the biggest enemy of the Christian outside of Satan himself is comfort, right? I mean, and comfort takes whatever form, you know, it looks different for different people. But so then affliction then being, you know, the complete opposite of comfort is what's going to drive an intimacy and a growth and a spiritual development. You know, look at the first century church, and right. You know, you see how it explodes in suffering and persecution. And so it's by God's very design, in a way, that he is redeeming sin and the brokenness of what didn't have to be per se, but is redeeming it and using it for his glory and for our good. And so it's a good thing. Now, those are not things that you say to someone in the midst of suffering, you know, because again, normally that's more unhelpful, but it's the truth.
Well, like you said, the roots of our faith come from suffering. And so to know that Jesus is the resurrection and the life, I think that's the big thing that I took away from her example as she's going through this. She's saying, actually, who we need is Jesus. You know, they're mourning over the fact that their friends died and Jesus didn't show up in time and so on. But the fact that he was using that to show on how he is the one who they need is showing us that if we have him, we can suffer well. And that it will be used to mature us, but also to get more of him. Yeah. I loved one new thing that I learned was when she talks about the new creation, like Genesis to Revelation, she's like, a lot of people think that we're going back to Eden in the end, but the truth is, like, no, we have a greater hope. New creation is better than Eden because we have Christ. And it's not that Christ wasn't before that, but that we as Christians now can walk intimately with him, and we know him more intimately through that. Adam and Eve knew God primarily as creator, but now we know him as Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And it's through this story of God himself taking on flesh and dying for us, and then walking with him by his Spirit, that we've grown to see just more of the depths of the riches of his grace and love. So God actually used something like the fall in a way to reveal just how deep his love and grace is and mercy is through all of that. So again, God redeems suffering. He redeems all of this. And so you know, it just reminds me again of just the hope that we have. And this is the same hope that the apostles talk about all the time in the New Testament, because he's writing to people who for most of the time are suffering for things they didn't do. And they're just suffering because they believe in God, you know, and he's pointing them again to their hope that they have in this God. And so we're called to persevere and endure. But Lane, to your point, we need others around us to do that. We're not called to suffer alone. Okay, well, any other thoughts? I know we've got a few more minutes, so any questions or things you guys wanted to discuss away from this chapter or you think would be helpful to to hit on.
I think I had something really good point that I was about to make, but it seems like it slipped my mind.
Dang, Lane. It wasn't about the new creation, was it?
I think it was. It might have been something close to what you had just said.
Yeah. That's good. Yeah.
Well, no, I think I feel like we've covered like a good bit of it. It was a good chapter.
Lane, I do actually have a question for you. You talked about this kind of briefly, but as a pastor that has been with people through different things, from points of suffering and all of that, you talked about just like your presence being helpful. Can you speak more to that for people that have someone that they know that just got devastating news, right? Like, what does that look like to pastorally step in and just be present?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I remember when I first got into kind of pastoral care and ministering to those people who were suffering, and I racked my brain about what do I say? I mean, what do I say? And it feels like, especially as the Christian and the believer, that you need to go in and, really just kind of have a talk or at least a sentence to kind of alleviate pain. And I got freed up from that very quickly, because when you see to the extent that people suffer in the way that they do, even within our church community, there's nothing to say. Of course, there's the truth of this eternal hope that we have and all the things that we've talked about. So what's called the ministry of presence is most important. And I found that one of the most helpful things that I've done is to be there. And again, I'm like a softy, super emotional guy. So a lot of times I'll cry, and I'll cry with people. And so if you have someone that is suffering in your life, be there. Let them know that you'll be there. You don't need to say anything. You don't need to feel an expectation that you need to give this kind of wisdom, because really at the end of the day, a lot of times that's about us, like that. Oh, I feel like I need to do this thing. And as soon as I do this thing, I've done what I should do. Now, in the same way that Jesus here models by weeping and by being profoundly impacted by other people's loss is one of the best ways to show Christ to people who really, really need him. So yeah, again, that's a good question, and I would just say just be there.
That's really good, and I think a great way to end. So, well, great. Well, listen, we have one more chapter, and then we're done. So next week is our last week. We're going to be reading chapter 12. How could a loving God send people to hell? So, I hope you guys have a good week. Thanks for joining us as usual. If you have any other questions based off of this, or would love to continue this conversation, feel free to add comments in the comment box or reach out to us. But other than that, we will see you guys next week. So goodbye.
See y'all.